I am alive. I live once again. Again, running a little late with this tonight. Seems to be the story of my life. My life lately. My voice. That'll be ever so useful. We left off, I believe, last time talking about divine magics, like the cleric and the warlock. At least that's the way I imagine them. The warlock is not generally classed with the. That's looking great, yeah. Classed with the cleric, but where I wanted to go this time, or where I wanted to go for the next video, was to discuss sorcerers specifically, because for me, I grew up with a lot of my fantasy having really just like one magic user class. There was just the magic user. They didn't make it specific to multiple classes. They were all sort of treated as some version of the same kind of thing going on in the world. So the goblin, shaman, and the studied wizard were part and parcel of the same thing going on in the world. And to a certain degree, I'm still approaching it from that perspective. But gaming has moved into a direction of doing the gaming, and a lot of storytelling has gone into the realm of looking at things from a perspective of magic from divine sources and magic from arcane sources. And even further, a lot of gaming has moved into the direction of well, that's not true. Some of them use things like nature magic. So you have like druids and stuff like that. So there is some of that. I suppose it's not really like discussed a lot. You have wizards who cast from spell books. You have priests who use divinely inspired abilities. Druids or witches and shaman who use nature-based magic. Sometimes shaman is mixed up with spirits, so ghosts and whatnot. I guess there's also sort of pacts with demons. So I guess there is a lot of it out there. But in the case of what I want to talk about today is the trend to differentiate a sorcerer from a wizard in a lot of fantasy fiction. And particularly in the gaming. I don't know that a lot of long existent fiction ever made the point of making a difference between the two. I've seen some saying that, you might be a magic user, but you're not you've been able to tap or touch magic as a magic user, maybe even a wizard, but you're not a sorcerer until you've reached a higher level. And for a long time, it felt like that's what a lot of people were saying. Nowadays, in tabletop gaming particularly, but you can see it sort of spreading into other games as well, like computer games and stuff. They're sort of delineating the difference to be one in which a sorcerer is an entirely different beast from a wizard. And the way they're doing that is sorcerer is somebody who naturally taps into the magical forces in the world. It's sort of like inherent in their build. A sorcerer doesn't need a spell book. It doesn't have to memorize spells. They can just tap into those magic forces and bend them to their will. Whereas a wizard may learn to figure out how to manipulate the energies around them and studies ways to do that. A wizard is more like an artist, or a wizard is more like a scientist, and a sorcerer is more like an artist. the scientist is studying the recipes and the formulas and the strategies and the plans and the tactics of assembling these forces to achieve a given result. And a sorcerer is more painting the world with magic to achieve a given effect. And that's sort of, it's a very rough analysis of that system. And I can get the distinction. I like the idea of making a distinction there. I also think that to a certain degree, it really does feel like things have gotten a little too cluttered with all these magic user classes. But to be fair, the fighter class has always had multiple classes. So the way I remember this, you had your fighter, you had your ranger, and you had your barbarian for fighting classes. You had your cleric and your mystic, or potentially a monk, for support classes. And then you had your magic user, maybe your druid, and you could kind of put cleric in with the magic using classes too. And then you sort of had your rogue and your bard as another class. And ranger could cross class with rogue. Ranger was sort of like fighter meets rogue. You also had the paladin in with the fighters. So, I mean, I guess there's room for expanding the potentials for magic user classes. So I don't think I can be too picky about whether or not we include it. To me, the instinct is always to go back to, like, yeah, we can have, you know, the druid class and the magic user class and the cleric be three sides of that magic coin. I don't know that my tendency is to favor sorcerers, warlocks, druids, wizards, clerics, and shaman and monks as all variants of some means of manipulating the forces of the world. But I mean, having the opportunity to be able to figure out how that might work in my system, I do think I can maybe make that work. So starting with the sorcerer is where I really wanted to get to today. I think next time I do a video, it may be about the wizard class. And then I might explore druid a little after that. For now, the sorcerer. And the real trick for me was, this actually was something I had to bounce my head off a little after I already tried to figure out where I was going, was wizard. Because I don't, like, again, I think I mentioned in the previous video about magic, I'm not a big fan of Vancian magic. Vancian magic isn't my favorite way of doing things. Now, I may make an adaptation of Vancian magic for something like a shaman class. Because I do feel, and I may even tweak it maybe for a druid. Because I feel like to a certain degree, there is a way to embrace that and play with it story-wise to make it more interesting. But the key thing to remember when dealing with Vancian magic is its goal is to set it up so that you can't have indefinite use of magic. And that sort of always there. Like, if you have the ability to cast Wish or Fireball every turn, why wouldn't you just spam that spell? And so the methodology that a lot of games use for limiting that, both computer and tabletop games, is to make a sort of limit, a limiting factor. So it could be mana points. A lot of video games favor a point system that you can use. The tabletop games have a tendency to prefer the methodology of saying, like, okay, you have 5 slots, 1 for a level 3 spell, 2 for 2 level 2 spots, and 3 for level 3 spots. And then 5th edition of Dungeons and Dragons came along and said, like, and you also get unlimited use. Now, to me, that option in 5th edition is both sort of like, okay, so why, like, you've done away with the limits. Why? And the answer to that is pretty much because the fighter gets to swing his sword as many times as he wants. There's absolutely no reason why you shouldn't be able to have a spell user class who isn't completely useless after 3 rounds. Like, if you have, on your first level, you have 3 level 1 spells that you can cast. Once you've cast them, you're useless. You're what's called some people I know call them squishies. They're a cloth wearing squishy. They don't wear metal armor. They don't have a lot of health points, hit points, so you can crush them pretty quickly. They're a grape, is what they are. If your high-powered, heavily armored, super strong, super sturdy fighter is a brick, then a wizard is a grape. It's just, there's no competition. You're smushed. And so, like, you end up standing in the background throwing knives or shooting crossbows, and it's just kind of like, why? Like, in gameplay, in narrative storytelling style fiction, which is one of the other areas I want to use some of this in, your wizard shouldn't be known for most of the time wielding a crossbow or throwing darts or daggers. That's not what a wizard is. In stories, a wizard is somebody who has access to magic. So why not give them a means of having magic all of the time? And so in this sort of situation, you want to give them the ability to always have a spell they can use, but 5th edition gives them cantrips that are minimally useful. It's the equivalent of being able to throw a magic punch, is really what they're giving you. They're giving you the ability to get into a fight and do some damage by fighting, but not so much that it's like, oh yeah, you just level the playing field. So it's giving them a fighting ability. It's the sword or battle axe option for a magic user. And that makes sense. Now, for a sorcerer, the trick with a sorcerer for most part is early stages sorcerers do not differentiate much at all from a wizard. Story-wise, there's the idea that some natural quality of yourself has access to the Force. That's what I'm going to call it, because that's what you're essentially doing. A sorcerer is essentially an untrained Jedi. They have the ability to tap the magical powers of the universe and wield them to do certain things. Now, that's narratively distinct. The next part of that process is the mechanic through which you apply it. And in game terms, it's not really that different. A sorcerer has really just the ability to fill certain spell slots with a certain number of spells per day and cast them. And it's only as you get into higher character levels that it starts to differentiate a little bit by giving you sorcerer points, which allows you to convert a spell that you memorized into spell points which then you can then convert into another spell. Whereas a wizard has to plan ahead and figure out which spells they need to know for the following day, which ones will be most useful for them, and plan and memorize those, and then they're stuck using those. A sorcerer has the ability to convert a spell into points that they can then use to buy any other spell they know. And so it gives them the ability to cast the same spell. They may memorize, they use their spell slots, however you want to say it. They may have their spell slots filled with 4 different spells. But if it's turning out they're in a situation where fire spells are useless, but ice or water spells are valuable, they can convert their fire spells into another use of a ice or water spell. That gives them a versatility that maybe a wizard doesn't have. That's the mechanic as it's being used right now. It's an interesting thing. And they also have added the possibility at a certain point that you have what's called meta magic capabilities. And meta magic allows you to bend a spell a little bit. And this is the part I'm interested in. So a meta magic spell, if your spell says it's range 1 foot in front of you or 5 feet in front of you, you have the ability to use one of your sorcerer points to extend how far you can make it go. You also have the opportunity to use a sorcerer point or 2 to target more than one target with a spell that usually only targets one, or you have the ability to make a spell last longer than it normally would, or any number of other slight tweaks. And I think there's a list of like 6 to 8, and it's usually like the range it can travel, the area it can cover, the number of targets, how powerful it does in damage, how fast you can cast it, and then there are a few things like you can cast it without making a sound, and you can cast it without moving, so that if you were trying to be subtle, you could just be standing there like this and cast a spell and not be seen to be casting magic. So you can say, like, I didn't move my hands and I didn't utter a spell, so it couldn't have been me. And so that opportunity offers role-playing opportunities for how you're using your magic. Some of the others, like increasing the power or increasing the range, change the mechanic of a spell. And all of those I find very fascinating. I do believe earlier editions of the tabletop game, D&D, had, I think, 3rd edition and 3.5, maybe even 4. I can't remember which one, had feats that you could purchase at certain levels that gave you some of those capabilities magic-wise. And so that's cool and all, but that's a waste of purchasing feats. Now, looking at the possibility of those techniques for manipulating a spell, I'm looking at the possibility of structuring my sorcerer class to have one 0-level spell, a cantrip, the ones that you can spam all day long. You can cast over and over and over and over again. I want to give my sorcerer basically 1, maybe 2 cantrips. And they never get another spell, at least for the first 4 to 8 levels. Maybe never. But here's the thing. I want to give them the ability to use those meta magic feats, those abilities to extend its power, extend its range, target multiple sources, extend how much time it can be used, cast it silently. I want those to be inherent class abilities. So you might start with a very versatile base level spell that does no damage, but can stun an opponent. Now, if you just add a little bit more using one of your character level feats, you can then tweak that spell to do actual damage. And if you do it more than once, you can tweak that spell to be even more powerful. So there gets a point where you can use your ability to bend that magic to high levels of damage. So like there's one spell in particular that comes to mind that's super versatile. It's called Prestidigitation. And this spell, as written in the player's book, has the ability to light a candle, snuff out a fire in a campfire. It has the ability to create a gust of wind, make the sounds of animals in the background or a whispering noise in the background. It's really just like stage magic effects. None of them can really do any damage. But if you can light a candle or snuff out a lantern, so you're in a room, in a dark room, and you just go, everybody has lights to see everything by, you go, you will regret what you are doing. And then, and all light goes out, and then they're in the dark and they can't see. Like, that's a massively, like, psychological, role-playable situation. And that's a valuable skill at a simple level that doesn't have to do any damage. But if you have the ability to relight those candles or turn them off, which Prestidigitation gives you, who's to say upping the power level of that isn't setting somebody on fire or putting out a house fire? You know, that's where you're starting to move up that level of power behind the magic. To me, that seems like the way to go forward with a sorcerer, because what you're dealing with in that situation is you're not giving them an infinite number of varied and multi-use spells. You're not giving them the fireball spell, and you're not giving them the featherfall and sorcerer's abilities of D&D. You're giving them a natural talent, like a sorcerer is supposed to have. They have a natural knack for magic. You give them a natural knack, a spell, maybe a couple related spells. And once you have those things, you get to twist and bend that to achieve different effects. If you have the ability to ignite a candle flame, do you have the ability to also heat meat? Could you cook chicken without setting it on fire? Could you cook it? Like, how can you bend that? And so the trick for that, for me, would be you have the base spells, 1 or 2 cantrips, and then you have the natural innate ability to bend those spells any number of ways. Extend their power, range, time, whatever. But you also have the possibility of, like, instead of having a Tensor's floating disk, which is just a platform you can stand on that keeps you floating in a certain area or holds up certain things for you. Like it's sort of like a wagon without wheels. Instead of having that be a disc that floats that you can put things on top of, what if instead you turned it on its side and used it to push things? And so that's a versatile use of a spell. It's a bending of the intent, a bending of its abilities to do certain things. And you're still using that same spell. So if you give them their base spells to start with and give them the opportunity to figure out alternative ways to bend that magic, that gives them way more versatility in what they can do with any given spell. But giving them the ability to rewrite the details of a given spell could potentially become rife for abuse. So I feel like having a caveat to that, having something that says like, yeah, you could literally push this as far as you want to push it, but there could be consequences. And partly because they're not following a recipe, they're just kind of trying it out, seeing how far they can bend and push and twist this spell. I feel like sometimes they're going to encounter a moment where they push a little too far in the wrong direction. And so having a dice roll, like if a fighter uses a sword, he rolls a d20. And at a certain point in d20, it's a hit. At other points, it's a miss. Having that same mechanic come play a role in the magic casting of a sorcerer, where at a certain point, this is a fail, and at a certain point, this is a success. But I think it needs to be like a graded scale. So it's not so much the result as a graded scale. It's more of the, like when you confront a situation where you're going to use magic and bend it to do a certain thing, how hard is that thing to do? If you're just trying to figure out if you can take the prestidigitation spell that you can use to light a candle and instead use it to burn letters onto a wall to spell out a word, that's not a huge departure from what you're doing. So that might be 1 or 2 points of difficulty higher. So on a d20, you might say, oh yeah, you can automatically cast this cantrip without any consequences. So your role for doing this is maybe like on a d20, roll a 5 or better. Like on the rare occasion, you're just going to absolutely bungle an unaltered spell. Sometimes you're just going to be that bad. But if you're going to go to the point where you are trying to target a opponent's weapon grip so that it burns their hand and they have to drop their weapon, that should be 3 or 4 points more. So like your base level cantrip of casting the spell would be like a 5. And if you wanted to burn letters into the wall, I can see maybe doing a not too different from a 5, maybe a 6. But trying to burn the weapon grip of an opponent, I could see that being more of a 9 to 12 range. So roll a 9 or roll better than a 9 to 12. And setting the points, the difficulties will be completely up to the game master. But having that sort of situation where this is super hard, and I feel like there should be sort of backlash it's not just that, like, well, your spell didn't work. It should be more along the lines of, well, what you were trying to do was beyond your ability to do it, and as a consequence, instead of burning your opponent's weapon grip or inscribing something on a wall with that heat, you burn your fingertips. So you incur 4 points of burn damage in some way. That's one possibility. I also do think that, like, having tapped into a magic and not being able to successfully control it should have a curse-like consequence. It's I mean, there are random tables you can use to roll consequences to a curse, and I do feel like maybe that's more of the flavor I want to go with, not just have the spell do to you what you were trying to do to something else. But sometimes, honestly, you could have a little bit of fun with the consequences of a spell failing. I'm reminded of a character I built a while ago where they were a type of character that's a natural shapeshifter, but they didn't know it. They had amnesia of their early life, and they sort of a post-traumatic incident, don't remember who they were beforehand and don't remember what they are, and they got a split personality in the mix, so that with their ability to shift, they are essentially two characters. Now, one of the characters is a healer and a druid. And so they have the ability to mix poultices and healing salves and those types of things. The other personality is essentially a monster hunter and a fighter, or a rogue, more to the point. But they have the ability / tendency to take the idea of, if you're a healer and you're making an action to try to heal somebody, you can roll a skill check and see if you succeed. If you don't, then the check fails. Now here's a question. If you're trying to heal somebody and you fail, do you potentially hurt them? Not usually. But I wanted to try to spin it a little ways here and say, like, so if you made a medicine, but you made it wrong, could it hurt somebody? And if you hurt somebody with it, my question was, could you use a healing skill for one character, the healer, but the other personality is somebody who hurts people? What if you intentionally flub healing checks in order to cause harm rather than heal? So somebody who could mix somebody who's under panic or stress or injury, you could give them a little bit of belladonna in a mixture and it works as a sedative. But if you don't give them enough, it doesn't have much of an effect on them. If you give them too much, it could harm them. Specifically, it could probably kill them. Using that same mentality, is it possible for somebody to then take the idea of, like, well, I understand that I can use belladonna as a medicine to help, but this particular character's personality is more interested in the negative things you could do with it. So intentionally failing to heal with a chemical. And that again is this idea of taking this ability and bending it to achieve a different effect. And I feel like having a certain type of consequence to a sorcerer casting magic, a potential, fail point. I want to intentionally structure it in such a way that if you're really crafty about it, you can bend a failure into a success. And that's the hard part, I think, for me to try to figure out going forward, is can you figure out how to make it so that there are consequences to being too ambitious with magic as a sorcerer? You can get burned when you're playing with fire. But could you potentially set it up so that when you're in an environment where frost is a danger, that you could try to do something and potentially fail, but even in the failure has a potential beneficial side effect. And in this case, it would be like trying to start a campfire, failing that spell, and instead ending up hot. It's like, yeah, either way, you benefit. But what are setting it up so that you can do that? That's the tricky part. And I think a lot of that's going to come down to whoever's game mastering. If you're in the middle of a game where the consequence for a failed sorcerer spell is decided by rolling on a random table, it makes it a little bit harder to narratively work that out. And that depends on the GM to make that workable. If you were playing in a game where I was GMing something like that, and I said, okay, you're going to use sorcerer's magic to bend this spell to achieve a certain effect. Roll to see if you fail, and describe what you're doing to cast it. And so somebody might describe a different way of approaching how this magic would work. And when they get to a point where they're describing this, their description will help me decide as the GM how this starts to go wrong. And maybe at that point, I need a little scale on my side too, to see how wrong could this go? Like, if this is something that it's going to go kind of bad for them, but leave room for them to be able to claim something out of it. If they're being super, super ambitious, they're just throwing all caution to the wind, then I should be able to say oh, no, you just burnt your hand off. You're going to need 3 to 5 days to recover from the injury you just did. But if they're doing something pretty creative and they're narrating it, they're figuring it out, they're strategizing it in such a way to mitigate the consequences of what they're doing, I feel like it should be within your margin to be able to reward that creative play with saying all right, so did this succeed? No, but you might be able to claim something out of this. Yeah, sure, your coat caught fire. You're trying to start a campfire. The wood is wet. You're in an environment that's not pretty conducive to that working well. You have nothing to light it with. You try to bend your magic to light that wood on fire. It's that candle lighting snap, but instead you're trying to light the campfire with it, and you roll and you describe what you're doing as vibrating the you're lighting the individual pieces around wood in such a way that you only have to dry out the portion that you're lighting in order for it to. And so I can then rule at that point, like, it's a good idea, but your failing roll says, yeah, you did light lots of little areas. Your aim was just a little off, and you've set one of the other party members on fire. Now it's his coat that's on fire. He has the opportunity to throw his coat onto the wood and reclaim the ability to have that campfire start. You have that option to be able to pull that off. And I was like, yeah, you could reclaim this. I like that idea. I just got to figure out how to mechanically develop that. Now, that's predominantly going to be, you can use it for planning storytelling. Storytelling usually doesn't require the mechanics to be quite as tight as that. But for tabletop gaming, that's where that kind of thing comes into play. It's a little bit harder to do that for a video game. Video games are going to require a random roll on a table that tells you the consequence of what you're doing. And so, like, I don't know how I would turn that into a video game. Like, that particular mechanic, I might set it up so that you auto default to a potentially useful way of using a magic in a certain scenario. And a lot of those scenarios are going to have to be very railroady. They're going to be something like, you're in that cave, the wood is wet, what do? Somebody tries to cast a spell. That spell has to have that roll of whether or not there's a succeed or a fail. On a fail spell, roll on this table about the consequences to have. And I'm probably going to have to build that table to favor potentially allowing, say, like, not just like there's a full failure. Every spell, success or failure, should probably have a secondary success scenario. So in that case, it's always going to default to something is set on fire, but you can use it to ignite the campfire like you wanted it lit. It just means that you lose an item to the fire. That'd be a lot harder to do for a video game design, I think. But tabletop game, I think that's a workable scenario for that. So basically, my structure for doing the sorcerer and tabletop role-playing and whatnot is to make one spell, maybe two at most, and maybe I'll make a second one available at a higher level. Make that spell available to them and nothing else. And then from that point on, it becomes a factor of bending that magic as many ways as you can imagine bending that magic. And I think that's really what I want to do for Sorcerer. I think ultimately it puts the mechanic in the direction of creative use of the character. And not just another, here are your spell slots, figure out how you're going to fill them, and then here's a neat little gimmick that you can add to what we gave you. Now it does have, I debate whether or not to allow them access to ritual spell casting as well. I don't think I want to. I don't think it suits what I want it to do, but that would depend on gameplay and seeing how well that works out in gameplay. I got to figure that one out, but in the meantime, I do think next time I'm on here, I want to talk about wizarding magic and how I want to change that, because that's a far more comprehensive change to magic that I want to do there. That one's a lot more complicated. Because again, I'm trying to reinvent Vancian magic. I want to get away from that pattern of doing things. I don't think it suits what I need to do for what my type of gameplay, I think. And wizards are the ones that are trickiest to do that with, I feel like. I mean, mainly because it's the core principle of how magic is using. Like I said, sorcerers essentially use the wizarding mechanic with a neat gimmick to it. Warlocks essentially use wizarding magic with a slightly different flavor profile to it. Even clerics essentially use wizarding magic. It's just from a different source. Druids, pretty much the same method of magic. And so changing that core is the hardest one to figure out. Like the sorcerer, the mechanic I'm using for the sorcerer, where it's all cantrips, and you can cast that as many times in a day as you want, but those cantrips are minimally effective. If you want to do something more effective with it, there has to be a mitigating factor of what you can do to change it. And I feel like there's an added element of sorcery manipulation, that meta magic capability. Like, how many meta magic effects can I add to this? The more you add, the more complications potentially you add to the spell. And that's an important factor. I should have said that earlier. Was like, you could stack 15 different meta magic manipulations to this spell to completely change it. You're turning the candle lighting spell into an ice storm. That's not a bend. That's a complete rebuild of that spell. But if you can talk your way through using, like, this changes the range at which I can send it. This changes the area of effect. It changes the type of damage. It changes the type of power that's involved with it. So it ups the power level 4 times. So at that point, you're looking at least 7, a factor of 7 to change that. And depending on like how much effect you want it to have, it may be as much as plus 12. So when you're rolling your dice, and you might have the ability to light that candle with a base level of 3 to 5, but plus 9 to 12, 12 plus the 3 that you start with as your base, you're looking at 15. So you have to roll your dice and beat 15. On a D20, the odds of that working in your favor are suddenly much more against you. You might be able to pull it off, but you might not. And so, yeah, building that scale of figuring out how difficult this challenge is going to be, and how, like, what's the base difficulty, and then how many meta magic effects are you stacking, and what is the point cost of each of those? It could be entirely possible that what you want to do to bend that meta magic, bend that spell to achieve your desired effect, puts it so that you would never be able to roll above it. It could set the limit at 32. You have no chance of rolling above a 32 on a d20. Now, the other end of that is you should be able to grow in power as a sorcerer as you level up. So if we're going to do that, is there a leveling bonus that makes it easier to do harder things with your magic? There should be. And at this point, it's figuring things out on a chart. Charting things out as I figure them out. That's what I end up doing. But wizarding is going to be a whole nother mess of problems. And I think we'll cover that next time. So, if you're watching this, hope to see you there. And why is that such a thing that happens?